The International Institute for Peace started a series with interviews from experts and analysts from its neighboring region and how they especially cope with the COVID-19 pandemics and what implications this has for its foreign, internal, and regional relations. You can see our videos on our YouTube channel as well as on our website iipvienna.com. We just recently did already some interviews on the Western Balkans and on Belarus, and today I'm very happy to welcome Ofer Zalzberg from Jerusalem. He's a senior analyst in the crisis group's Arab-Israel project since 2010, and he especially covers the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well as Israel's relations with its neighbors. And he also furthermore leads a religious peace-building work stream, and he's affiliated with the Vienna-based Herbert C. Kielman Institute for Interactive Conflict Transformation. Welcome, Ofer. In 2019, in September, we invited you to Vienna together with the Austrian Study Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution and the Herbert C. Kielman Institute to give a public talk about the, at that time, upcoming elections in Israel and what the implications will be if there will be an alternative to Netanyahu in Israel. And now, as we had the third time elections in the beginning of March, I would say we see that there, for the moment, at the time being, there seems not to be a real alternative to Netanyahu, as yesterday Benny Gantz and his Blue and White Party agreed together with Netanyahu's Likud to form a grand coalition where, which will be led in the first 18 months by Netanyahu himself. Nevertheless, Israel is in a very specific situation when it comes to also the recent developments when it comes to the pandemic because of the societies living in there. On the one hand, the Israeli societies and the Palestinians on the Palestinian territories, but also within Israel and the Arab Israelis living there. So my first question to you would be, how did Israel react on this pandemic? What are the implications for the people living in Israel, but also on the occupied territories, and how the whole situation can be perceived right now from a point from within Israel? Maybe you can just give us some short inputs on how the situation there is.
Gladly, and thank you for this opportunity to continue our dialogue. Israel is in a similar size to Austria, so the comparisons are made often by Israeli politicians from right and left. And basically, Israel was very quick to close, the aerial space and not to allow incoming flights. It had difficulties on other issues. And in effect, the virus was, at least so far, was really curbed its outbreak. We have roughly 15,000 cases for a society of 9 million people and about 200 fatalities, slightly less, which is relatively low. Israel, however, faces another challenge, which is being intertwined with the Palestinian society as a result of the proximity and, of course, of the conflict, the occupation. And the Palestinian society is in a very different situation in terms of GDP, in terms of its capacity to address the virus. And whereas within Israel, we see two sections of society that in a way lag behind. One is the ultra-Orthodox, where there was some disregard for the state regulations early on, continuation of prayer and Torah study, which led to massive contagion in that sector of society. And the second one is the Arab part of Israeli society, Arab citizens of Israel, who have spiked later. It was mostly the Jews who come from abroad who came with the virus, and the Arabs are the second wave. We are seeing on the Palestinian society that it was foreign tourists who brought the virus, mostly in Bethlehem. And we are seeing that because they don't have many other measures, there is a dramatic lockdown, much stronger than in Israel, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. Luckily, so far the cases in Gaza are very few, really a dozen, but because it's so densely populated, if really the outbreak will be massive there, we're talking about a very high death toll and a dramatic crisis in an already severe situation, a dire humanitarian crisis. So the major concern that everyone has is whether there will be massive contagion in Gaza. We can talk later about the details, but in terms of the direct health consequences, Palestinian society so was really, the contact so far is very limited. It's a few hundred cases.
Okay, so you say that especially, of course, the people in the Gaza Strip are quite vulnerable, but you also mentioned the Israel Arabs living within Israel, and then also how it is impacted on the ultra-Orthodox. Nevertheless, maybe when we come a little bit to the conflict lines and the conflict dimension, I mean, what does this current situation means for the potential impacts when it comes to measures of the conflict dimensions between Israel and Palestine? I mean, what would you expect like, from this conflict transformation? What does this mean, these new measures now introduced in there?
So first, let's divide this to several arenas. The conflict is fragmented. I'll start from an Israeli point of view. In East Jerusalem, the main concern in Israel is that the flailing hospital system and health system in East Jerusalem will actually lead to a collapse, as the mayor warned, of the entire health system in the city. If there are not enough hospitals in East Jerusalem, then East Jerusalemites go to West Jerusalem. If there aren't enough beds in West Jerusalem, people are left outside. And really, the health system in East Jerusalem is very frail. Among other things, 3 years ago, the Trump administration defunded the hospitals in East Jerusalem, leaving them even weaker. The PA has been unable to pay some of its own debts to the hospitals. And the hospitals in East Jerusalem provide health services to all of the population in the West Bank, not only in East Jerusalem. So the major worry in Jerusalem relates to health capacities. And Israel is doing what it can now, including trying to fix Palestinian-American relations, which have been very bad since President Trump did the Jerusalem Proclamation and recognized Jerusalem exclusively as Israel's capital, so that there will be a renewal of US funding for Palestinian institutions, including the hospitals. In the West Bank, we have a different issue, which is also a merge between economic factors and political ones. And the major concern pertains to, in effect, the economic viability of the PA. We are seeing economies around the world contracting as a result of the severe measures they put in place to curb the virus. But the PA economy has been very weak. It lost a lot of international support. I mentioned already that it lost a lot of US support. Israel froze quite a bit of the tax monies that it is collecting for the PA, claiming that the PA supports terrorism by giving money to prisoner families, prisoners who committed acts of violence against Israelis, including Israeli civilians. And there is suddenly an inverse need where Israel is trying to see how to get more money to the PA rather than freezing it. And finally, the main concern with Gaza, which is also conflict related, is that if the virus does spread in Gaza, the leadership will not be able to do much at the health level. There is an attempt to build a few more hospitals there. Turkey helped somewhat, and there is an American association that is helping. But compared to a population of 2 million people of such dire need, this is very small. And the concern in Israel is that the leadership of Hamas will feel that it has no other way but to essentially escalate against Israel in order to deflect the blame and to scapegoat Israel for the crisis, because it will not be able to answer to the complaints and accusations from its own population about why it does not deal with the crisis. Obviously, that leadership is dealing with the situation of blockade. It also cannot operate freely. And the leadership in the West Bank is dealing with this as an occupied party. And both sides, meaning both Hamas and the leadership in Ramallah, need to find a way to cooperate with the occupier in order to curb the virus. Challenging for both sides, for Israel, that that is very reserved about these two parties, particularly Hamas, and for the Palestinian governments. So we are seeing that the conflict dynamics are interwoven into the health-related attempts to curb the virus.
Okay, and what does this mean, like maybe especially for Eastern Jerusalem? I mean, now you cannot, the ultra-Orthodox, the people cannot really go there, they cannot pray at the Western Wall at the moment. I mean, how do you see, like, how is life going on there in Eastern Jerusalem now with the COVID-19, and what implications does this have on the conflict lines as well, which is Jerusalem is a big issue for all the different people involved and all the parties involved in the long-lasting conflict between Israelis and Palestinians?
Absolutely. So as you say, there are two issues in Jerusalem. One is the holy sites, both the Western Wall and the Temple Mount Haram HaSharif. And both are in effect under lockdown. Last three days ago, Israel renewed prayer in very small groups, up to 19 people at the Western Wall. The Waqf so far does not open the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Palestinian society the virus reached Palestinian society after Israeli society. So Israel allows itself to relax some of the restrictions before Palestinians, but it's very complicated. It appears to Palestinians in Jerusalem as if Israel is part of preventing them access to Al-Aqsa, together with the Waqf, but allows Jews to go to the Western Wall. So the first question is really access to holy sites, and I remind the listeners that we are just on the beginning of the month of Ramadan, the most important month in the religious Muslim year, where people would like to pray particularly at Al-Aqsa. So this is a major challenge. The reason that it's a major challenge is, of course, that if many people will go to pray there, be it the Western Wall or Al-Aqsa, it could lead to mass contagion. On Fridays of Ramadan, we usually have 150, 200,000 people in a very small place for such a number of people. So this is the first thing. And the second thing is really for the population, and particularly the Arab population, that does not, on the one hand, the PA is not allowed, since the Oslo Agreement and it's the way that Israel applies it since 2000. The PA is not allowed to operate in East Jerusalem and cannot operate also at the level of health, ensuring social distancing, ensuring quarantine of those who are ill, and so on. And Israel was late to come into providing these services after a policy of 50 years of neglect. So this is a very vulnerable community, which is most in direct contact with the Jewish population in Jerusalem as well, working with each other and so on. So we will see. I think that the responsible adults need to deal now with this in a way that takes into account both the religious and national sentiment to the city and the very practical interweaving of the two populations.
So there are many new challenges also for the new government now, I would say. And maybe we can also talk a little bit about now the forming of the government. What does this mean for Israel and also, of course, the Palestinian territories? And maybe you can also address a little bit about I would say it was quite a success also of the joint list, because they have been gaining actually 2 additional seats as far as I know, and how happened this, because traditionally they did not really be such a big part of the parliament in the end. I mean, what implications can this have in the future governing period? What is your stance on the government right now, and also, of course, taking into account the charges Bibi Netanyahu is still facing or might not be facing? That depends on how laws of immunity will be going to be introduced or not. Maybe you can give us also about what the big coalition now between Benny Gantz and Netanyahu. What can we expect? And then also, do you think that he really will, after these 18 months, he will step back and give it to Benny Gantz? I mean, this rotation idea, what they have been introducing?
Excellent. Good questions. So I'll start with your permission with the way that the coalition negotiations happened, and as you say, the important role of the joint list, that is the Arab majority. During the coalition negotiations, there was an attempt initially by Benny Gantz and Blue and White to form a minority government, which will nevertheless enjoy a majority in the Knesset thanks to support from the outside of the joint list. And the joint list did something unprecedented in these 3 sets of elections, and it was willing to recommend to the president. He didn't do it since the time of Rabin, so he didn't do it for over 20 years. To recommend to the president a Zionist candidate to be the Prime Minister of Israel, a Zionist candidate who was Chief of Staff, who is known for having used military force against Palestinians, notably in Gaza. And really, we are seeing a shift in the degree to which Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel are willing to participate in Israeli electoral politics. And this shifted the calculations of everyone. And really, because of 2 seats moved around, we would have seen such a coalition forming. So we are really, they were almost kingmakers in this reality. And I think what they've learned from the fact that it failed, and it failed because 2 Knesset members out of the Blue and White party were not willing to sit in a government that was supported from the outside by the joint list. And they explained that it is not because of their ethnicity, but because of their ideological opposition to Zionism in the sense of Jewish nationalism and its right to having a nation state. And some of the leaders of the joint list, this is a new generation, younger generation of leaders, are now basically doing their homework. Is there a way for us to rethink our ideological positions without giving up on who we are, our Palestinian identity, and our commitment to a Palestinian state, and so on, and nevertheless accept Jewish nationalism? And I think that this is a very interesting discussion, and I hope Israeli Jews will explore this with them. But so far, they have failed to affect this. As you said, blue and white, at the end of the day, was divided particularly on the question of immunity for Netanyahu, and split over this question, over whether, nevertheless, power sharing with Netanyahu is justified, given the COVID-19. It split to two. And those who felt that the health crisis and everything ensuing from it, economy, society, psychological trauma, and so on, justifies it, are led by Gantz and Ashkenazi. They have reached a coalition agreement with Netanyahu. And after the split of blue and white essentially split into what we can say is a center-right party led by Gantz and Ashkenazi, and a centrist, even center-left party led by Lapid and Ya'alon. So we are seeing more ideological clarity now. I would say that the most significant thing that came up in the coalition agreement between Gantz and Netanyahu is essentially support for annexation of territory in the West Bank. This is aside from what you have pointed out, the decision to, in some cases at least, override Supreme Court decisions and give a measure of immunity to Netanyahu. We will see exactly how it plays itself. It's not clear that it will happen. Blue and white thinks that it will not happen. But there is clearly some erosion here. They clearly opposed to having someone who is already indicted in 3 charges as prime minister. Netanyahu did not have everything he wanted either. Netanyahu thought he will be able to govern alone. And what we are seeing is that there is no replacement for Netanyahu in Israel so far, but Netanyahu is forced to share power, and he can no longer exercise it alone. He has to share power with Israeli centrists who do not share many of his views. And whereas the coalition agreement supports in principle his right to bring forward annexation from July, which is in 10 weeks' time, Benny Gantz is briefing journalists and telling them, whereas I allow him to bring it forward in the agreement, I will do what I can to oppose annexation from within the government. Gantz will be defense minister. It seems Ashkenazi will be foreign minister, so they will have some levels over this. We can talk about it later. And I think that Israel really will need to, otherwise, the coalition agreement really paralyzes each party. They each have a veto on all of the major decisions, which means that it looks like there will not be major decisions taken in terms of Israeli grand strategy. And instead, Israeli policy will be more reactive. And it will focus on dealing with the crisis, at least in the initial year or two. This is a very severe, of course, crisis in Israel as elsewhere. And as I've noted, this has also conflict-relevant implications.
Okay, very interesting, because you also mentioned this annexation, and then we also had in the recent month, we have been also hearing this big, the big deal, or the Trump deal, the peace deal, which essentially has been rejected by the Palestinians in a very strong manner, I would even say. But yes. Now you also mentioned, and I think this is quite interesting, also this new younger generation of Israeli Arabs also being part of the political life, and who are also not really believing so much more in the two-state solution. Would you say, from your point of view and from your analysis, that the two-state solution for the time being is buried?
So I think that we are the old way in which people thought about the two-state solution, namely one that is based on sharp separation between the two societies, seems increasingly unlikely. It will require massive evacuation of many settlers. It requires basically limitations on Palestinian access to 78% of what they view their homeland, Jewish access to 22% of what they view the most important part, historically and biblically, of their homeland. So from that point of view, it was a problematic paradigm to begin with, and it's looking increasingly impracticable. Still possible, I would say, in some certain scenarios, but not in the current one at all. What I think we are seeing is, nevertheless, including in the younger leadership, these are people in their 50s, they're not kids, the younger leadership in the joint list, is still a strong commitment to having two governments and two states, but trying to do it differently. So we still don't have a single Israeli party that says, let's do a one-state solution where you also have a principle of equality. And as you said, with respect to the Trump plan, once you don't have a principle of equality, one of the two sides is almost bound to reject this. So I would say that despite the receding prospects of the sharp separation two state, still everyone is looking, it seems, implicitly at least, for some other way of doing two governments. And it could be two states, maybe in a more confederative way, maybe in a more mixed way. I think this is the most relevant conversation to look at what other visions there could be, while still not ignoring the fact that there are two national sentiments. On the Palestinian side, the Palestinian liberation movement, arguably, the Palestinian national movement in particular, was never weaker. But Palestinian national sentiment is very strong. Palestinians do not say that they are no longer Palestinian, that they don't feel Palestinian, that they don't feel they need to exercise self-determination. And from that point of view, the conundrum, the dilemma is still quite similar.
Okay, so what you're describing, Mr. Nolzer, this concept of we already have is widely also discussed, this two states, one homeland. So you say we should enter a discussion about what other possibilities there would be despite still having this two-state solution somehow in mind, or how do you assess that?
So this paradigm of two states, one homeland, I think has been, it has been advanced by very progressive activists on both sides. And as a result, I think these are people who have more of a liberal, progressive, usually cosmopolitan, universal morality. And this paradigm so far failed entirely to win support, not only of any single political party, but primarily of people from the conservative right in both societies. It fails to show that people who hold dearly national identity and or religious identity usually are reserved about it. And from that point of view, this is not what I would say is likely to succeed. I think that we still don't know what exactly is likely to succeed. We need something else. This is already on the table for several years, and we don't see that it enjoys traction. But there are elements of it, which I think are indeed very useful, as you pointed out. I would just add, it looks like that there is, given the Trump plan, given this possibility of imminent Israeli annexation, the context is shifting. And the parties find themselves needing also to react to a reality that changes, what is feasible and what is not feasible. What is the starting point in a way. So I think this question of whether there will be annexation or not could be quite significant. Whether the Trump plan in some shape or form will be imposed on the parties, notably through this Israeli-American bilateral committee of mapping, that its aim is to reach a decision what kind of areas in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Israel will be allowed to apply its laws to. And again, this could happen as soon as July or August. And what Gantz did now, I think, is very significant, and the virus is very significant here. What Gantz did was he basically added caveats, and he said, annexation will be supported by Blue and White only to the extent that it will not harm the Israeli-Jordanian and Israeli-Egyptian peace treaties, and to the extent that it preserves Israeli strategic and security interests. And to the extent, one final and third caveat, that it enjoys full US consent. These three things have to be fleshed out. And this is on top of, so what do they mean? We have to see what will be the reaction from Amman and Cairo, and whether they will claim that annexation is mutually exclusive with parts of the peace agreements, and then what it will lead Gantz and Netanyahu to conclude. We have to see whether the Israeli defense establishment, that so far was not involved in dealing with the Trump plan or any policies on its back, whether it will claim that implementing it is in line with Israeli strategic interests. For example, the Trump plan suggests to give areas in the Negev to the new Palestinian state, so that some of the isolated settlements could remain part of Israel. Many in the defense establishment in Israel think that this is a wrong move because these areas in the Negev are used for military training. Israel is a very small country. So this is direly needed for military training, the Air Force and so on. And finally, the US. What does it mean, full US consent? And specifically, does it include support from the Democrats and from presidential nominee Biden, or will blue and white say that Trump support is enough? This is very important because we already see that Gantz says, I made a compromise on annexation. We may see annexation in a few short months. And I want to just point out a link between annexation and dealing with the virus. I already mentioned that the PA is now very, very vulnerable economically. And already its economic viability is threatened. A move of annexation by Israel, what Israel wants to do is to apply, what Netanyahu would like to do is to apply Israeli law to all Israeli settlements and to the Jordan Valley. For Palestinians, this would mean a major blow to the two-state solution, relating to your question. It will mean that it will look as if Israel is abandoning two states, thinking that a Palestinian state will never happen. This is this reading will mean a high cost in terms of the political credibility of the leadership in Ramallah, which wagered its future on two states. So what we are seeing is that annexation could come in a time in which they are already economically very vulnerable, could make them politically very vulnerable. And this situation is very risky, I would say. It could push in some ways, not just the current PA leader, but the entire current of the PLO that approach things in this way from the cliff, so to speak, very figuratively. Not necessarily immediately, maybe gradually. And in a way, the advocates of annexation would have preferred to do this move when the PA was robust enough to sustain such a blow and continue to move on. And it so happens, the chance has it that the virus created a situation in which the PA is particularly vulnerable just when Israel has what it views as an unprecedented window of opportunity for annexation. The last few months of the first Trump presidency will end in November, and possibly Biden will be elected, and he has already, his advisors and he himself already stated that he opposes annexation.
So you also touched upon a little bit on the region when you were mentioning like what will Egypt say, what will Jordan say, but also I mean there is also another I would say regional challenge, a very big challenge still ongoing, and this is the war in Syria, and this is also of course affecting Israel, and not only because of Syria itself, but also about what Iran has been doing in there, and also this rivalry between Iran and Israel, like now in times of pandemic, in times of new elections. The European Union is also quite occupied with itself, so also with the COVID here, so people are quite not so outspoken on what is going on like on in other parts of the world for the time being. So how do you see like the regional challenges for Israel? Israel does not exist in a vacuum. It is its location is quite specific where it is located, and the ongoing war there still has implications on Israel. How is this treated nowadays and in all this COVID and new government, and how do you assess this?
Excellent. So first I'll just say Israeli leaders see now a moment of opportunity to be more assertive against Iran because the virus hit Iran particularly hard. And, we see, Iranian leaders who suffer from it. We see the economic situation, of course, was very dire to begin with after the years of sanctions. And there are hopes in Israel and in some parts in the US, of course, that this will lead the Iranian leadership to finally make certain concessions, both with respect to future nuclear negotiations and from an Israeli point of view to accept a new nuclear agreement which assures zero enrichment in Tehran, but also to roll back its presence regionally and to be less willing to confront Israel and other forces in places like Syria that you have mentioned, but also elsewhere. And Israel so far was very focused, of course, domestically, but we are seeing already some relaxation of the measures. And to the extent that in Israel, people will feel that Israel is already dealt with this enough domestically that it can again be assertive regionally, we could see in the next few months, again, because of the window of opportunity I supposedly mentioned, the supposed window of opportunity I mentioned, meaning that the Trump administration is still in place and will allow Israel to be more assertive. Israel is already acting in Syria now, even during the fight with the virus. But this could expand. We've already seen Israeli strikes in Iraq and, of course, in Lebanon. This could expand further. Yemen, the Red Sea. because the sense in Israel is that President Trump is very shy, is very coy when it comes to actually confronting Iran militarily. And that at the end of the day, in order to make the most out of Iranian vulnerability, Israel will have to ratchet the pressure. So this is one conclusion, perhaps, that people draw today from the situation, and it is more of a short and medium term, meaning the next month, the next few months. Then it depends very much on US elections beyond that. And maybe we can have another conversation by then, but to put it simply, if President Trump is re-elected, then Israel will view it as its role to increase the pressure on Iran, including militarily, against the backdrop of the virus and the sanctions. And then I think the additional arenas become even more relevant. A Biden administration, I think it will depend on the degree to which it will continue with Obama's pivoting to Asia and things like this, or will be more present in the Middle East. In the Gulf, you also see Gulf countries who feel that basically the US has taken a step or two or three back from the Middle East, and feel that there is a need to, at the very least, to show to Iran that there is another potent military force, namely Israel, not themselves. And at the same time, in the Gulf, you see a different stance, one that does not want to see direct armed conflict with Iran, fearing that they will experience most of the backlash. They will pay much of the cost. They are much closer to Iran. And this, all of this happens while Israel continues what people here call the war between the wars, which means a low-intensity war between Israel and Iran taking place in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iraq. And I think this will continue. We are seeing that Lebanon, Syria, we still don't really know, and Iraq are also suffering from the virus. And this creates conditions in which it's harder to deal with external attacks sometimes. So I think that a certain increase in the military interaction is quite likely in the next few months.
Thank you very much, Ofer, for this very interesting interview and this very interesting insights into what is going on within Israel. What does this mean? What are the implications for the Palestinian society there, but also for the Arab Israelis living within Israel, but also the whole region? I mean, it seems that there is not going to be a direct military confrontation, but that Israel is taking advantage of course, the weakening of Iran due to the pandemic, and also, of course, due to the sanctions which have been reintroduced after the JCPOA was abandoned a year ago. Thank you very much, Ofer, and I hope to continue this conversation with you. Maybe we can follow up in some month and see what became true, what came out of this Trump plan, what about annexation, how did the European Union react, if it is going to react, if it is going to also speak with, I would say, a dense voice, like one voice, so there are 27 of us. We will see. It's going to be interesting in the future still. So thank you very much. Please stay safe and stay healthy, you and your family, and have a nice day. Thank you.
You too. Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.